Hi everyone, it's Dr. Loyola here. I hope that you are all continuing to do well with your online learning and with this kind of new social distancing COVID campus situation that we all find ourselves in. So this video is the first for our final unit, and our final unit is on electronic literature. So what I'm going to do in this video is first I'm going to contextualize electronic literature both as it fits in with this final unit in the class and as it works kind of as a broader field of literary practice. I will talk about some of the basic tenets and some of the history of electronic literature, highlighting what it is and demonstrating that even though the era of the personal computer is a mid-1980s and to today phenomenon, the practices of electronic literature actually predate that period. So I'll try to give you a sense of that history of the practice in the field. And then the bulk of this video is actually going to be showing you lots of examples of electronic literature and kind of highlighting some of the major stylistic trends and practices that we see within this field. So by the end of this video and this lesson, you should have a good sense of what electronic literature is, what it looks like, what kinds of texts include electronic literature, and something about the history of it. And then I'm going to close with just focusing on where we're going to take this for the rest of the class, because we are kind of in our final unit, our final 3 weeks of content. So that's an important thing to address. So let's move on to first placing ELit in this class and contextualizing it within the semester that we've been having since September. I'm sorry, since January. This is the spring. So first, we kind of organized this class has been organized around 3 models of digital humanities work. The first model in our first unit was applying humanities methods or humanities approaches, humanities concerns, and bringing that to digital objects. And for that, you all wrote your interactive essays, and you also have those presentations on digital humanities work that's based in books, right, and studies of things like Google and artificial intelligence and memes and so on. So that's that first model, is taking a humanities approach, humanities concerns, and applying that to a digital object or a digital thing in the world. Our second model was the reverse of this, and that was taking a digital method or a digital approach, a digital tool, and applying that to a humanities object. So for this, we looked at digital archives for saving cultural heritage, for saving literature, for saving cultural histories, and so on. And for that, you all did your recipe markup, right? So creating rich texts for digital preservation. And then the second part of that unit was distant reading, which you've all just completed, right? Which was taking this broad computational pattern recognition, applying it to text and applying it to literary objects to kind of see what patterns emerge within a literary text when a computer reads it rather than a human, right? So when we can apply computer levels of pattern recognition, which are fairly superior to human abilities. So how we can see what patterns emerge when a computer looks for them. So that was model 2. And now we are on model 3. And model 3 is kind of bringing these two things together and creating new objects in the world that are both digital and humanities driven. So that kind of this nice marriage of the two concepts, but for creating new things. So this covers a lot of ground. So it can refer and often refers to things like tools. So some common digital humanities tools that would fit within this model are things like Zotero, which is like a text database and bibliography producing tool. Omeka, which is for creating digital exhibits. Again, thinking of vast collections of objects and exhibiting them almost like a virtual museum. Or something like Scalar, which is a new writing platform to enable people to write long-form texts that are multimedia networked rather than based in print in a book. Another thing that this model of DH work can cover is platforms. So on your screen, I'm showing you the Mercatu platform, which is a platform that is specifically created for saving Indigenous culture. But one of the things that Indigenous culture that's very important to it and that this platform seeks to address is the principle that not everyone should be able to have access to everything. And that actually goes pretty counter to Western cultural models of digital work, right? When we think of the internet and when we think of putting content online in something like Google, for instance, and like Google Books as like a foil to this, we tend to think of that as this model that we are making information available for everyone to access. And that really runs counter to this cultural position, which says not everyone gets to access everything, and that's okay. So Merkurtu is a platform that specifically seeks to host Indigenous cultural artifacts, but at the same time that works against this Western model of openness and accessibility for all within that digital space. And then finally, another model or another form of work that falls under this model is creative work. And that's kind of where we're going to be focusing. So creative work can be anything from electronic literature, digital narrative, interactive essays. The interactive essays that you all wrote at the beginning of the semester are great examples of this because you created a new object that was humanities driven, right? It was a written argument-based essay, but it was also digital in that it requires a computer to play because it's on Twine, and it hosts lots of multimedia objects, right? And it's interactive. So you've already kind of done this, and now we're just going to really kind of dig into this, looking at electronic literature. Okay, so let's turn now to our first kind of big question within electronic literature, and that is, what is electronic literature? What does this even mean? And as with any kind of creative practice, really the best way to have a sense of what it is to see lots of examples. But one kind of some strong working definitions and some ways that you can kind of just start to articulate what this is that electronic literature, and this is a quote from Scott Rutberg, who's an expert in the field. Electronic literature, he says, is works with important literary aspects that take advantage of the capabilities and contexts provided by the standalone or networked computer. And he does specify that difference, right? So we tend to think of computers today in 2020 as networked, right? So they're online, they're within that network, the World Wide Web network of other computers. But of course they don't have to be, right? And the computer itself does not need to be online. So if you turn off your Wi-Fi, if you turn off your data, whatever, your machine still does certain things, certain computational practices that are not based on being networked, right? And so that's what he means by the standalone versus the networked computer. Another way to think about ELit, another requirement, is that it needs to be what we call born digital. And that means that it's work that has always been digital. It's never, it's not about print becoming digital. So it's not these archives that we've been looking at. It's not an ebook, right? It is instead work that has always been meant to be experienced through and with a computer, and that has no other format. And then finally, a thing to keep in mind with electronic literature, and this is another quote from Rutberg, is that the new forms and thematic concerns of electronic literature do not emerge from the technology itself, and that means that this isn't about letting the new fancy machine or the new fancy technology lead the creative practice. Rather, it's about letting the creative practice drive what you look into your technology to do for you. So that's what he means by the second part, that they emerge from the interaction of new technologies with aesthetic concerns that have much longer histories. And that's an important thing to keep in mind, because again, I don't want you all to leave this class with this sense that everything digital and everything creative through a computer is inherently new. That's actually a major thing that the field works against. So keep that in mind, that this does have historical threads and historical backing. And as I go through these forms of electronic literature and these practices and these examples, I'm going to try to clarify for you some of how that history builds out, thinking about literature more broadly, right? So to keep in mind that the technology is new and the presentation is new, but in many cases, the concerns or the creative drive is not new. It's actually something that writers and poets were thinking about long before the computer came and made some of these things possible. Okay, so now that we have a working definition and we have this call to historicity out of the way and kind of in the space, let's turn to the bulk of this video, which is walking through some of the threads and forms of practice, or genres, if you want, within electronic literature. So you've already seen some of this just in the 6 options that I gave you all of things to play before you should watch this lecture, right? So the 6 texts that I put in the weekly modules for today. And those were 3 apps and 3 pieces that were all done through a browser. And you'll notice that that really offers kind of a range of options. But that even within that range of options, there's lots of things that are similar. So all of them have a focus on interactivity and participation that kind of looks at making the audience a little bit more engaged and active. That helps keep the audience more actively engaged in the creation of the narrative and in participating in the narrative. You'll notice that there's an attention to multimedia, so getting beyond just the focus on text and thinking about image, sound, animation, kinetic movement, and so on. So lots of multimedia. And you'll also see that everything is necessarily experienced through a computer, where computer here is in kind of the broad sense of the term to include your smart devices. So not just a laptop or desktop, but your phones as well. Right, so these are all, again, going to be really common themes that we'll see throughout electronic literature and throughout what's going on. And those also speak to long histories of literary concern. So literary concern has been thinking about ways to create narrative that's more interactive and thinking about ways to make a text feel multimedia and enhance sound and enhance vision, even while working in a book. That those have, as I said, long histories within literary experimentation. And this isn't like a class in literary history, so I'm not going to do too much there, but just again to keep that in mind, that that's not new because of the computer, right, or new because of the technology of this literary practice. So I'm now going to go through a short survey of genres or types of ELit so that you can get a sense of the overall field. This really doesn't in any way kind of take the place of full classes and books that are written on this field, but it is going to showcase for you a sense of kind of the wide ranging of what can be done within this sphere. I'm also going to show you a few examples of each type of genre because I think that they're all much easier to kind of grasp and see when you actually have an example of the text right in front of you. And then finally, I'll give you a working definition of the practice, or try to give you some language to clarify what that practice is so you can recognize it beyond this class. Okay, so our first type of ELit that we're going to focus on is hypertext fiction and poetry as it exists both on and off the web. And I'm going to give you one example that's off the web and 2 examples that exist on the web to give you a sense of kind of how this works. Again, remembering that the web is simply our networked computer. It is not the computer itself, right? So it's not a requirement for your computer to be online, to be a computer, and to do like computery things. So a hypertext is a narrative that is created through hypertextual linking. And it is creates a story that is in the form of a network, but again, not necessarily the internet network, but rather like a branching narrative path that is non-linear or non-sequential reading. So for instance, when we read a book, we tend to read linearly from page 1 to page 100. And we just go right in that direction. We don't tend to jump around from 1 to 50 to 22 to 43 to 75, right, and so on. Though certainly we could, right? There's nothing in the form of a book that stops us from doing that except for convention. But a hypertext really kind of works to challenge that convention. And it tells a story where even on any given page, you can have multiple links out to another branch of that story. So often in a hypertext, you navigate it by clicking on a word or a phrase and jumping around to a next part of the text. So this is based in allowing the reader to have a strong amount of choice and a strong amount of participation in how the text is going to unfold. And so this responds to some literary practices and experimentation in, as I said, like readerly participation, making the reader an active participant in how the narrative works, which is also thinking about things like authorship and authority, what it means to be an author, what kinds of power you have as an author, what power you have to give up to your reader versus what kinds of power your reader can have. And then also issues of nonlinearity, right? So how could we tell a story that isn't based in a linear progression through a text, but rather that allows a reader to jump around to different choices that they make? So some examples of this, an early example that's non-networked is The Patchwork Girl by Shelley Jackson. And this is on your screen now. And this was created in 1995. And it is a feminist retelling of Frankenstein that kind of imagines that Victor didn't destroy the girl creature in Frankenstein. So there's a point in Frankenstein where the creature says, I will stop hurting people if you make me a companion. And Victor does that, but then kind of halfway through, he freaks out and he destroys the companion creature. So Patchwork Girl says, what if that didn't happen? And then tells that story, and puts that story in perspective within the act of creation, the act of writing, the act of storytelling. And it's a hypertext based on that kind of concept. So as you navigate the hypertext, you can move from any page, basically, within the text to another, rather than linearly. So you kind of have to decide from this map that you're given at the beginning, that's a body, which you can see on your screen. So you have to decide at what part of the body you want to start, and then kind of navigate your way through this story that's branching and disconnected and so on. A more popular example that's not necessarily based in fiction is Wikipedia, right? Because Wikipedia is also on your screen now. And this is where you have a series of links from page to page and within a page, right? So you're not necessarily reading linearly. You always have the option, and in fact, the encouragement through this blue text to jump around and like move around within that encyclopedia. And then finally, if you may or may not have chosen these from your homework, but Hunt for the Gay Planet and Bandersnatch were both examples of this from the homework. So both of them are made with twine, which you will hopefully remember from your multimedia essays earlier this semester. And you can see where in each one of these, if you played them, the reader is given options for how to make the story, for how to direct the story, right? And these options will lead the story or will lead to lots of different experiences of how the narrative unfolds. Okay, so our second style is kinetic or combinatory poetry, often presented in Flash, though not always. Sometimes it uses other platforms. So kinetic or combinatory poetry is a form of poetry where the words and letters and phrases move around on your screen to combine or arrange in different ways. And this is not always interactive, but often it is. And kind of its analog form, again, just to think more popularly, is this magnetic poetry, right? Where you're given a little case of magnets with words, and you're encouraged to kind of write your own poetry by moving and recombining the words, however they may be on your refrigerator, right? Or whatever other surface. So this is in response to literary experiments in poetic form, right? So what does it mean to write poetry? And which is simply recombining words, right? So how do we write poetry? What types of form can poetry take? It's again, we kind of see with this interactive mode, we see this engagement with bringing the reader in as a form of an author or as a participant in the poetry making itself. We see an attention to kinetics and animation. So thinking about text as a movable entity and as a material entity that's not just a word, but also like a thing to look at or a thing to think about as an object. And then this also connects to traditions of poetry as performance, right? So when we receive poetry in like a literature class, we tend to not think about it as a performance. We tend to look at it as a static text on a page that you just read for a class that you're required to read or whatever. But of course, poetry has a long history of being performed. And when we put words into a kinetic or a combinatory space, we reinvigorate that performance, right? Because the words literally perform on the screen for you. So a few examples of this. First, from 2000, on your screen now is a text called The Dream Life of Letters by Brian Kim Stevens. And this is an animated poem that was made in Flash, which, according to the poet, prompts us to think about letters as having their own personalities, as having purposes and dreams and desires and so on, that are enacted through these movements, right? So kind of thinking about the affective qualities of letters and as words and as word forms by watching them move across the screen. Another example on your screen now is called Veniverse, and this was created by Stephanie Strickland in 2002. And here you're presented with a constellation of the night sky, and each star produces a line of poetry. And so you can write poems by clicking on different constellations, highlighting different star shapes, and that will produce new lines one after the other to write different poems as you traverse the night sky. So there's no given order. There's no direction to the constellations or to the lines. So once again, we kind of see this focus on nonlinearity, this focus on bringing the reader in as a participant, and thinking about nonlinear networked writing, right, and networked poetry and storytelling. And then a final example that's on your screen now is from Between Page and Screen. This is a more recent text created in 2012 by Amaranth Borsuk. And this is an augmented reality work. And it's written as a series of letters between two lovers named S and P, which is screen and page. But you have to read it because the book itself are just these little QR code things. And you have to read it by holding those up to your computer camera, which will then display the text as augmented reality. And you can see again that text is animated, it recombines, it will take a shape like the pig. And so this is kind of drawing our attention again to thinking about text as material, physical entities in the world, rather than just words that convey a meaning and don't have some kind of meaningful quality to themselves. Okay, so our third form of electronic literature is computer art installations, which ask viewers to read them or otherwise have some kind of literary aspect. So this is like a literary art installation based in computers, where computers are brought into real spaces and people or visitors to the installation need to interact, they can interact with that space through the computer, and something that has to do with the installation then reacts to the person, right? So again, we kind of see this direct participant being brought in. Often these kinds of ELit have some kind of augmented reality element or some kind of computer-based content that responds to the presence of people, but we should know that that's not necessarily required. That's just a very frequent part of it. And one of the cool things that happens in these installations is that they really challenge our sense of computer-based content and digital content as permanent. Right, so in our second unit, right, we talked a lot about cultural heritage and how creating digital spaces for our texts and for our histories helps make them somewhat more permanent, right, and helps keep them alive and circulating and stores them for longer. And this actually challenges that entire concept that things that we make through a computer is to make them permanent and to focus on permanence, because installations by definition are time-based. They are performances, which means that they are not happening forever. They have a set period of time that they are installed in a museum or in an exhibit space, and then they're gone. And then you can access maybe records or texts about this installation, but you cannot access the installation again. So two quick examples of this. First is Text Rain. This was created in 2000. And in this one, you can kind of see that text seems to rain down from the ceiling, and it responds to users' bodies in space. So it will roll down people's arms, it will pull in your hands, it'll respond to kind of what you're doing in that space. And you can direct that flow of textual rain to kind of write with these disparate letters as they fall down. So again, we kind of see this focus on participation, combinatory poetics, kinetic text, but in this kind of installation space. And then the second example is called the Kimchi Poetry Machine. This was created in 2014. And this is kind of crossing now into physical computing. So thinking about computing as physical things rather than just as kind of cloud-based non-physical entity. And in this case, you have this jar, which is kind of riffing on the metaphor of fermentation, which is how, of course, kimchi is made. So you have this fermentation jar, and when you open it, poetry will start to happen audibly. So you'll get these sound bites of poetry. And inside the jar, there are small poems written on paper, which people are invited to take and then tweet out to kind of share this poetry and spread it beyond this installation. So in this case, kind of the artistry behind some of this is thinking about the metaphor of fermentation, the process of making kimchi, to think about the process of writing poetry, or of computing or of creative work, right? Where opening the jar becomes a metaphor for like opening a file, opening a book, otherwise processing or performing that work. Okay, so our fourth kind of ELit to think about is conversational characters or chatbots. And these are computer programs that act like characters to chat with you or produce some kind of narrative content, usually in an interactive conversational mode. Often these are text-based, like in a chat room or like text messaging. But really important to remember here is that the conversation is happening with a computer, right? So the person that you would be talking with in one of these conversational chatbots is a computer program, not an actual human. So a couple of examples here. First, and this is one of our earliest forms of ELit, is ELIZA, created in 1964 through 1966. And ELIZA is a natural language processing program, so a chatbot that works on natural language, that follows certain scripts so that it looks like she really talks to people. But of course she doesn't, right? And the most famous script, though, for ELIZA is the doctor script, where she would give psychological feedback and advice and phrasing that is very similar to a therapist, right? So she'll say things that sound like you're talking to a therapist. But of course, this is all based on that script that the computer is running. And then a more contemporary example is, and a little bit goofy, is Infinite Scream, which is a Twitter bot created in 2015, which just screams. So it just generates screams all the time on your Twitter feed. And if you tag it, it will also scream at you. So for instance, if you just say like, oh man, this is a moment for Infinite Scream, then that scream will happen and kind of appear in the Twitter space. So that's kind of where some of the conversation comes with, is that this is a bot that will reply to you and doesn't just scream into the void without interacting with people. All right, our fifth model here is interactive fiction. So interaction is a really open term, right? And it usually means, we usually tend to think of it as meaning some kind of shared work between two different actors. So between a book and a reader, or a computer and a user, a video game and a player, right? We tend to think of these as interactions. But what we kind of need to back up for a second is that all narrative, of course, requires some kind of interaction, because you, the audience, are always given content that you need to interact with, even if it's just in your brain, right? Even if it's just mentally, to actually get the narrative itself, right? To picture what's going on, to imagine the scene, especially when reading a book, right? You have to kind of do that mental interactive work with the narrative to get there. So because of that, interactive fiction as a term is almost not meaningful, because we always interact with fiction and we always interact with narrative. So when we talk about interactive fiction, what we tend to mean are text adventure games. So some kind of like participatory interactive game space that's entirely based in text, and where you actually play the game or interact with the system by typing in text commands. So one example, you did have one of these as a homework option, and that was Photopia. And this is a game where you type in commands to the parser, and then it will respond based on what you've typed in. So it will, if you type something like walk north, it will then tell you what you see if you walk north. Or if you say examine the rock, it will tell you like, oh, the rock is dirty and cold. right? Or the rock is too heavy to lift, or something like that. So you give it commands of what you want to do within a space to move the story along, and then it will respond in kind, right? And kind of build out that story as you play this text adventure. Okay, so our sixth model is literary apps. And this is apps that can be mobile, they can be web-based, they can be desktop-based, but they must in some way have like a literary or narrative quality as their core purpose. So a thing to remember here is that this is not an app that can host literature. So this is not a Kindle app or an iBooks app, but it's an app that only exists to tell a story in some way or to be literary in some way. So some examples to show you is first this Frankenstein app, which is a retelling of Frankenstein to make it interactive, kind of choose your own adventure style of Frankenstein, all hosted through your phone and through this phone app. A couple of more interesting examples, to my mind, is first the Silent History, which you can see on your screen now. And this is a mobile story that has to be done through your phone app because it's also geolocative. And that is a type of ELit that we'll get to at the end of this list. But what that basically means is that there's content of the text that is tied to physical location. So you can only access it if your phone is in that location. So this is one where it exists in the App Store like any other app, but its entire purpose is to host this story, right, and to support this story. So just like you have game apps, you have literary storytelling apps. And then from your homework, Upgrade Soul is kind of the best example of this, given how much it kind of is based in traditional text, like a graphic novel. To create a kind of interactive multimedia graphic novel. However, more recently, like in the last year, e-literature scholars have argued that we should start expanding this to include less text-heavy narratives. So that's where things like Pry or Tender also qualify as a literary app. So those were all of your examples from the homework for kind of looking at these apps that are in some way playing with storytelling, playing with narrative, playing with literary experimentation, and so on. Okay, so our seventh model is poems and stories that are generated by computers, either interactively or based on some kind of set parameters at the beginning of the story being told. So this is something that is similar to chatbots, where this is an instance of ELit where the lit itself, right, the story or the poem, emerges from the computer program. So in this case, the thing that like the human or the artist actually wrote is a computer program with some kind of storytelling parameters that the computer understands. But then the computer actually writes or performs or produces the narrative or the poem. And often it is with an intention to randomness and generation that are not as focused or we're not as able to do as humans, right? Or trying to force some kind of randomness into the process. So the other thing to think is that in this case, the model that we've kind of seen of the participatory reader, where the reader gets to play as a writer and kind of help direct the story, that's now shifted to the computer, where the computer becomes the collaborator, right? Or becomes the co-author that produces the work. And then at the same time, I do just want to clarify that this actually also relates to a long history of literary experimentation about creating randomness within the writing process. So here's an example on your screen now from a French poem, 100 Billion Sonnets, where in this book, each page has a sonnet, so 14 lines, and then each line is cut underneath it so that you can flip through at multiple levels and generate random sonnets, right? So you can just kind of have 100 billion sonnets just through this book and through this textile manipulation. So there are tons of examples of this. This is a really rich area of electronic literature experimentation, especially on Twitter with literary Twitter bots, which we will look at a few in a second. But first, before Twitter, this one that I'm showing you on your screen now is called Taroko Gorge. And this is JavaScript based, where the programmer has written some kind of parameter for how long of lines of text to produce, what creates a stanza, and then how often to produce the text at what speed, and then added different words and different phrases that the computer combines according to those parameters to write this poem. Looking instead to Twitter now, which I said is kind of a rich area, here's just a few examples. So this first is a Twitter bot called poem.exe, and this is another one where the computer program at the back end produces these little poems. So somehow the programmer has specified line length, line number, what kinds of words can be added to create the poem, and so on. This is one called Strange Voyage, and this gives these kind of little snippets, these little scenes of as if you were kind of voyaging through different spaces. You can kind of see there's a kind of fantastical quality to them, a kind of dreamlike quality to them. And then this final example is a magical realism bot, and this is a bot that actually writes, produces tweets according to the genre called magical realism, and that is a literary genre that is from South America, with Gabriel Garcia Marquez kind of being one of the primary authors here. Also, Isabel Allende. So it is considered like a Latin American literary mode that has to do with telling a realistic narrative that has these magical moments, but that are not told as fantasy. Rather, they're created as a kind of realist, in a realist mode. And then I'm just going to pause here for a second with the note that you are going to be making a literary Twitter bot in a couple of weeks. It's going to be awesome. You're going to do great. And this is, as I said, like a consistently popular assignment. It's one of my favorites. So that is something to look forward to and something to think about. All right, our 8th mode of electronic literature is collaborative writing projects that allow readers to contribute to the text of a work. So this is one that really kind of literalizes this theme that we've been seeing of making the reader a writer, or letting the reader participate in writing the text. And this is one where actually the reader writes what appears as the text. Again, this does have roots in print, but what has shifted is that now that we have the kind of immediacy of digital communication, we have this sense of real-time contribution that can really make the reader's additions kind of happen in real time for other readers experiencing the text. So some examples here. First, this is textual healing, which is an installation where users text the like the author account, and then those texts will be displayed as these projected little like chat bites up on these cityscapes. So in this case, you kind of get this narrative that comes together that's like the chatter and just like the thoughts of people in a given space or time. And in this case, the author has actually completely given up their authority over the narrative, and instead it's just what readers say that is what appears as the text itself. And then to return to an app that I mentioned earlier, the Silent History, this also incorporates this model, and readers are invited to write their own pieces that can be set in this world, kind of like fan fiction. So, and then those pieces will get geotagged wherever that reader is. So if I wanted to write something set in the Silent History world and then say that it was set in Myrtle Beach, then that would be incorporated into that overall narrative and geotagged to Myrtle Beach. And that means, of course, that it would not be accessible unless someone was in Myrtle Beach and in the space where I wrote it. So that it would be, again, kind of that physical location, that geolocation tagged to the literature and the literary content itself. Okay, our 9th model is what are called literary performances online that develop new ways of writing. So this is one that I think the words of what it is basically explain what it is, so it's hard to provide a definition that doesn't just say what I just said. So I'm instead going to point you to just a few examples of what this can look like. So this on your screen now is a piece called Snow by Shelley Jackson, the same author who wrote The Patchwork Girl, that earlier hypertext that I mentioned. And this is a story that is written one word at a time in snow, and then shared through Instagram as she takes pictures of each word that are then posted on her Instagram account. So some things to note about this and how this is a new form of writing is that first, it's writing that is completely bound to natural materials and dependent on the weather, right? So she can only really write this piece for a few months out of the year because it doesn't snow all the time. When she does one word at a time, right, that's another mode of writing that we don't tend to think about. And then we have to read it differently, right? Because Instagram posts stuff most recent first and then the oldest last, we actually have to read it in the reverse order from the oldest Instagram picture kind of backwards up to the newest. Otherwise, the text is backwards, right? If we read it from new to old, then the text is going in the wrong direction. So that's kind of an example there where it's this performance that's happening online in real time of as she posts these pictures, but that we have to read differently. It's modeling a new form of writing and kind of challenging what we think of as reading and writing in this new mode. Another model of this is what's called netprov. And this is internet improv or networked improv narrative. So it's basically improvised storytelling that's told over networked media. So again, we see these focus on participation, interaction, collaboration. They're multimedia driven pieces. And they are basically performances that take place online, published in real time, but that later become like an archive of that event. So this example that that's been up on your screen, this is one that is based in Dungeons and Dragons that's hosted by Mark Marino, and it's actually going on now. And you can kind of see that effectively players create characters and then they interact with one another on Discord according to how their characters would be. So kind of like an RPG, but also like a storytelling practice on this Discord collaborative social network space. Okay, and then the final style of ELit that I'm going to focus on today is locative or geolocative. So this is one that I've already mentioned in passing with the silent history, and this is narrative or some kind of poetry or literature that is tied to a location in a tight technological way. So usually based in data, so location data and geotags that is bound to some kind of content. So we already talked about the silent history, as I said, where in this app, certain parts of the narrative are geotagged, so you cannot access it unless you are in that place, right? Or really unless your phone is in that place, pinging the cell towers. But another example of this is on your screen now called the Transporter Immigrant Tool. And this is an activist-driven project where the idea was that burner phones would be circulated at the border in Mexico to help immigrants cross safely through the desert into the United States. This was never actually done, so it was more of like an art performance experiment than really an activist intervention. But the idea was that as immigrants crossed the desert, the phones would lead them to things like water or help them avoid dangerous plants or animals, tell them where they could find food and so on. And then it would also offer poetry at certain location spots along the way. So the idea here was that this was like a safe border crossing app, so it would help guide people and keep them safe as they cross the desert, but it would also provide a kind of emotional and intellectual safety in this poetry, right? By kind of feeding and taking care of the body as much as the soul in this kind of dehumanizing and crushing journey through the desert. Okay, so that does wrap up this kind of quick survey and overview of ELit. I know that was like a lot of pieces coming at you pretty fast, but hopefully you can kind of get a sense of the range of what the field offers, but also see some really recurring features, right? So lots of attention on readerly participation, on interaction, collaboration, focusing on multimedia, experimenting with really questioning what it means to write and what it means to read and how much writing and reading are based on our devices and our technologies that we do or that we use to do these activities, right? So that's really kind of the overwhelming theme behind a lot of this practice to kind of keep in mind as we go forward. So going forward, as I mentioned, we are going to focus on two particular forms of ELit in this class. Next week, we're going to spend a little bit more time on kinetic and interactive poetry. And then the following week, we're going to talk about a little bit more about generative writing with Twitter bots. And in each one of these, we're going to focus on, I'll give like little lectures shorter than this one, just on the space, kind of relocating everybody to this creative practice. But really, we're going to focus on making some of this. So we're going to make a collaborative, interactive poem as a class. And then you're each going to get to write your own Twitter bots. And don't freak out. I promise it's going to be great. It's not, I mean, it is some coding, but it's not impossible and it's not terribly heavy. So Everyone is always successful at this, so we will get through it as well. So I will see you all soon for this work, and thanks so much for your attention here for this ELit survey and introduction to the new unit.